Boyd Varty is a lion tracker. That means he wakes up in the morning and literally follows lion tracks through the savannah so that people on safari can find them later in the day. Through that work, he has honed deep intuitive gifts, which many modern people have lost. And now he uses those gifts to help people track their deepest callings. We chat about how to authentically pursue your life purpose, the role of the non-rational in guiding you, and how to get back on your path if you've wandered off. Inside each of us is a natural, innate knowledge of what it is meant to do. So to begin, that's a quote from your book, A Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. And I'm very curious how you would describe what you are meant to do, at least in this phase of your life.
Oh, wow. What a beautiful intro. I think right now, in a distilled way, the mission is to help as many people wake up to the fullest self-expression of themselves in this life as possible, to help them tune into a non-rational way of knowing and to live creatively and dynamically towards that, into a state which points towards, I make no claims, but points towards living as awake as possible.
You said non-rational. About 5 years ago, that would have set off my alarm bells and I'd have been like, out of here. But I'm very interested in that. And in fact, a huge limitation in me, which was my rejection of the non-rational. And so what role does the non-rational play? And what does that even mean?
Well, almost always when we arrive at a juncture and when you do enough work in the field of helping people transition into lives that feel like a deeper expression of themselves, not the box ticking that is presented to us constantly by the culture. But the minute you start to do that, it doesn't matter whether you're working with a billionaire or a stay-at-home mom who's trying to find what's calling her forward. Almost always there is some sense that I'm stuck, I'm uncertain to move forward, or I have infinite possibilities to move forward on. There's a whole lot of rational things that I should be doing, that I have to be doing. And I know you've ticked some of those boxes. And so great, that everyone, my whole life, I've been told who to be. But now I'm at this place where I'm looking for something deeper. I don't even know what I'm looking for. I just know there's something for me. And usually what happens there is we have to start going into the non-rational. Mm-hmm. Now, the rational will be a tool, but what I mean by that is like when we enter into those realms, we're looking for aliveness. We're looking for literal energy that expands in the body. We are looking for the things that pull you forward. I mean, that physically make you sit forward in your chair. And what I've noticed is that when people start to pay attention to those type of things, it starts to pull their life into dimensions that are beyond what they could have imagined they should be doing, and beyond what they've been told, if you do these things, you'll feel successful. So it's a playful practice. And I know that play has also been a mantra for you lately, but like moving towards a different set of metrics. And I have found that becoming a little non-rational as you do that starts to pull you into unusual directions. And even if it's not the ultimate direction, it is certainly going to start to change the pattern and dynamic around how you think you should be. So the minute we do that, we start offending identities, which is something I like to do when we start looking for a new way of expressing ourselves.
So I'm very curious. Did you discover this like on the track as you were tracking lions? Or do you get to a juncture, or I'm imagining there's an infinite number of choices that can be made when you're deciding left, right, or there's not even a path. Do you feel pulled in a direction, like somatically in your body when you're out there tracking?
Yes. I mean, I would say that, it's a good question. I would say that it requires form to leave form. And what I mean by that is like, firstly, you have to practice and develop what we would call your track awareness. So your track awareness is literally your ability to see tracks that no one else would see. And part of the magic about being out with an excellent tracker is they are seeing these very obscure scuff marks, geometries on the ground. They've taught their eyes to see specific things. At the same time, they're tapped in to the way the animal moves. They understand that animal's behavior. They've almost allowed the animal to enter their body. So first, there's a technical skill to it. But then at higher levels, it starts becoming, they start making these giant leaps, creative leaps, starting to almost understand what the animal would do. And it becomes almost predictive. And so it's a very high art form. The same as if you were to train martial arts or chess. First, you have to develop a bulletproof technical skill set. And then at high levels of technical prowess, you leave that skill set into the realm of flow, free-flowing decision-making. You find your body just doing things in the martial arts that you're not consciously trying to do. It's reactive. It's in the mechanics of the body. So it's the same with this sort of thing. I would say that you have to develop the skill of starting to attune to a different set of metrics inside yourself, energy expansion, the way the body talks to you, all of these sort of more ethereal sort of inner non-rational states. And as you get better at starting to attune to those, you start to become more intuitively able to live on that.
That seems to imply, which I like, that there are stages of one's journey where the quote unquote appropriate thing to do could look very different. So when you're in more of an apprenticeship stage, as you mentioned, martial arts or music, maybe you've got to learn your scales or your basic how to throw a punch correctly.
Yes.
And there comes a time where it's like, at first, what's funny is most kids hate that. They hate the rigid structure of having to learn. And there's this creativity that almost gets broken down in that stage as you learn to follow the rules. And then just when you get so good at following the rules that you can execute and perform and receive trophies and awards and people clap for you playing, to get to the next stage, you have to let go of those things, which is so frustrating because it's like, I spent so long in this paradigm of learning to perform what had come before me, what I had been taught rotely. And now I'm expected to go into this, this inner creative thing, which was almost more present when I was a child and I didn't want to listen to anybody.
When I was a kid, the trackers would take me out to a game path, which is a path that connects a waterhole, to an open clearing. And they would say to me, go and walk down there and come back and tell me what tracks you see. And I would walk down the path and then I would come back and I would say, I can see the tracks of a hippo. And they would say to me in Shangaan, it's a young boy, go look again. I would go walk down the path. And this time, as I looked more closely, I would see where sometime during the night, a mouse had run across the path and an owl had come down to grab it. And then as I looked more closely, there was where a leopard had walked down the side of the path and had been sort of washed out as the hippo had walked down after it. And the crazy thing was that if I walked down that path, I would see a number of tracks, and every time I would see more tracks. But then if my mentor walked down the path, he would see 10x what I was seeing. And that was a crazy idea to me, the idea that there is information there, but you have to teach yourself to see it. And so the first phases of tracking and transformation are starting to actually just put attention in the right places, starting to teach yourself with rigorous discipline to pay attention to certain things, to see how life is trying to talk to you, how your body is talking to you. And then, as you say, at high levels, it starts to become being willing to let go of that and allow all of that technical skill to be unbridled into kind of almost non-technical, because you start to move into the improvisational. And if you watch a great tracker predicting how an animal is moving, and you can only predict with high levels of skill after hours and hours of technical following, and then suddenly you start stepping through the doorway into being able to predict and knowing how that animal is moving. It's such a profound metaphor for life. And that sort of is the encapsulation of my work. Growing up, I watched hundreds and thousands of hours and spent thousands of hours tracking animals. And then later, when I moved into the realms of personal transformation, I started to realize that so much of the skill set and the mentality of the tracker was transferable to this other part of life that we call looking for our purpose, or what I would say, moving on to the track of our life. And that's another interesting thing that I would say too, is that at very high levels of mastery in any quadrant, it becomes transferable. And that's also a strange thing, because almost if you know how to get to a level in one dimension, you know sort of what it feels like to be excellent at something, and you know what it took to get there. You start to know how you might get there in other dimensions too.
I see. You're saying cross domain. Okay, so
Yes.
I misinterpreted, but it did raise a question for me that I wanted to check, which is I've almost, in the way that you've tracked animals your whole life, I've tracked people. So I've watched very carefully. I have another channel that is very related to social skills, what to say, when to say it, how to say it. And for a while, I both learned and taught it in a more direct, rote expression, which is like, if this, then this. If this happens, this. If she texts you this, don't say this. And I succeeded with that. And there were people who are beginners in a lot of these stages. Maybe they're nervous to talk to a girl or don't know how to speak to their boss, who really benefit from that training wheels style of like, use this phrase. Yeah. And I find that I'm getting similar questions, but I'm unable to authentically answer them with that level of say this, because it's no longer the truth to me. The truth is the frustrating, ethereal advice that I got when I was a kid about being yourself and letting go. And so I'm curious, it seems this has really freaked me out because I've made my life teaching this sort of stuff. And now I feel almost disconnected from the beginner in a way that I'm not as able to be of value. And I'm curious if you've seen or thought about anything like that, because it's been a nerve-wracking experience to go, oh shoot, I don't know that I can sit here and continue to teach the scales with the same level of enthusiasm that I used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the only thing that I've seen as a remedy for that is time in the space. I mean, I used to have a teacher who was more in the realms of shamanic training. And to be honest with you, most of the time, because he would not come down to where we were, he would teach at a level so far beyond us that often we had no idea, frankly, what he was talking about. But only with time in the space with him did the gap start to close. And I started to be able to perceive much more clearly what he was up to, but it took a long time. And so the only thing that I've come to see as a remedy for that is being around someone who's embodying it all the time. But you need time around them then, if they're not willing to come down and lay the foundation. So it's one of the challenges of teaching and of art in some ways is like when you're moving away from kind of where the goats can get at it, and you can get detached from where most people are entering. And so I guess another form of the art form, and I've seen this in great trackers, is to be able to go back to like where beginners are and understand where they're at. But it takes a real love and willingness to be able to go there all the time. Yeah,
to traverse. Well, you said it. You know, my first business is totally at scale. It's on the internet. There's no in-person classes. There's no sustained embodied experience at all. And that's been one of the things that I've considered is, well, that may not have made sense for that phase, which is let's just do like the level 1 or 2 stuff that is totally shippable, can put it in a book or a video, anybody can get it. But for the stuff that I'm most interested in now, it might be me learning to deeply embody it, which is my learning because I'm not complete in that. And then I've heard this about meditation masters, which it's not what they say to you. It's sitting in the room with them that changes you.
And that brings you again to very high levels of, in any practice, you know, you're almost always moving to higher levels of refinement. And so then we start talking about what happens in someone's field, in the physical field around them. And certainly if you sit with someone deep in Zen, or if you're in someone who's been in medicine circles and really understands that space, you'll feel the whole space can go to a different level. And it's like everyone's unconscious can sense the depth that they can go to in the presence of this other, where this other person operates. And so they let go at a deeper level. So I feel like I hope I'm not too
well, part of what I'm doing, you know, it's funny. I used to plan these conversations so much more, and I'd have an arc for them, if you will. Like that's my 101 way of podcasting, and I'm experimenting with the much more loose, where does the conversation take me approach.
So sort of what we're talking about here so far is tracking, inner tracking, and some of the dimensions of mastery almost.
Yes. Well, let's take it to some of the pitfalls of tracking. So I believe that you've had, well, I know from reading your book, you've had a number of close encounters and even have been, I think, attacked by a crocodile. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That is right.
So in our lives, we have this experience where we have this gut instinct and it says, marry that girl or buy that business or do this thing or go into that cave. And we get mauled sometimes from these things. And it can lead to real questions of, can I trust my intuition? Can I trust my discernment? And I think we all have that wound at some point where we've followed our gut or our heart and we've been hurt by it. And I'm curious how you understand those experiences.
Yeah, sure. It's a deep question. I would say that, there are a few things. The first is I consider everything a practice.
Mm-hmm.
I approach my life as a practice, which means that I'm never arriving anywhere. I'm always in the practice and then stepping back and sort of asking myself how the practice is going, what's working, what's not working. So in that place, I notice where I overstep, I notice where I understep, I notice where I make a mistake, and then I can constantly review myself and see like what was driving me in that moment. So that's one thing, to approach the practice of being in practice.
Yeah.
Second thing is like a tracker, I have come to decipher, learn to decipher with more accuracy what my actual motivation is. And I have come to realize that often, as I've gotten to know myself better, often when I've been mauled, it's because the thing that was running me was not the most present part. It was some pattern or some compensatory dimension. Okay, what's a great example of this? How familiar are you with parts work?
Very.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a version of parts work. So the idea of parts work is that at certain phases in our development, we develop certain strategies. And in some cases, those younger parts are still running the show.
Yeah.
And so I think the art form is to really start to be able to feel in, and this is where I think the body is helpful. Often learning to read the body is really, really helpful, and figuring out which parts are running you is the other part of that game for sure.
Yeah. Do you have a sense, and I know this is a particular one, but I think you got bit by a crocodile. Do you have a sense of what might have been running you at that point, whether it was a need to prove yourself or something else?
Well, that one was actually a technical mistake.
Okay.
What happened was, one, I assessed the situation wrong. The water was running clear over sand, and you could see, you had good visibility. And then there was a place where a tree had fallen out of the bank, and it had there was a little sandbank that fell away, and it was shadowy. And if it had been a horror movie, upon reflection, someone in the audience would have said, like, don't go in there. So one is I slightly misassessed the situation. And I always think good safari guides are people who have made a few mistakes over time, because it really, you don't get that wrong again. The second thing is that I was stuck in a paradigm. And the paradigm was, from the time I was a child, I had swum in the river. But what I didn't realize is that the area had been in conservation for 50 years. And the crocodile population had radically grown in the 20 years since I was a kid swimming in the river. And so where it used to be a very low percentage type of issue, the statistical danger had gone up around me. And so that incident was, a combination of those things. And yes, there was probably a little bit of just youthful hubris in there. So whenever something goes wrong in the nature, it's usually a combination of things coming together. And in that case, that was what happened to me. In other cases, when I've been charged by lions, when I've had something growl at me in a very serious way, it's either because I've missed a few important signs, or at certain times in my life, it's where I've pushed where I shouldn't have pushed. And so if you went out into the wilderness with me now, you'll find me extremely conservative in my risk assessment. And that's because I've got it wrong a few times. And so the value of that experience is now I have I've been down the wrong end of a couple of things. And so that I feel like having been there is it's positive because I grew from those experiences. And two is just my decision making has changed dramatically around that. So I want to stay well south of any potential issues.
Yeah, it seems to make sense that you almost need that hubris and lack of experience in young men in order to forge new possibilities. Like you can only find the edge by crossing it and getting hurt.
Exactly. Yeah, you gotta find the edge and then develop better decision making structures and improve your risk assessment. And then the thing that is so interesting is as you improve your skill set too, the safety profile starts to go through the roof. And so, for example, when I take people tracking now with my two other mentors, Alex and Renias, because there's three of us together and because you have such a high level of dynamic decision-making, and we're almost like a SEAL team, we'll refer decisions to each other and different people will lead at different times. But all of that experience with a anchor in being conservative and always being safe means we can actually go places that other people couldn't go because we're so confident in the decision making and we're confident in being able to handle situations. So whenever you're in that realm, again, I guess this is in the realms of mastery again, like it's paradoxical because you need to be able to, your skills, refining your skills, mentally preparing for dangerous situations, facing edges allows you to go where most people couldn't go. And as you get more experienced, you have more trust in when you think it's right to be conservative. So you're always weighing risk options.
So so let's take this back to probably where a lot of my audience is, which is not necessarily out in the bush. I imagine a lot of them are having questions around purpose with their career and their work and things like that. It seems like one thing to call out might be that I've seen is that the risk assessment around career ruin tends to be very skewed amongst successful white collar workers, meaning that they think that trying to do their own thing would lead to ruin when really I've seen many people do it. You can get restarted. You might lose a bit of social clout. You might fall behind a year or two in your savings plan, but it's usually not life ruining behavior. I'm curious, in the coaching that you do with people, what sort of blocks do you see around people stepping more fully into that non-rational purpose that is sort of calling them?
Yeah, so I'll try and land the plane a bit here and link how tracking and the work of finding your purpose can come together. So often, one of the big challenges is that when you set off to find the track of your life, the first movement almost always, as if you were setting off to track a lion in the wild, it begins with not knowing. The first thing that you have to do is become incredibly comfortable with an amazing amount of uncertainty. And if you grew up in a society that has conditioned you through school, through college, through every iteration to know, that's just so extremely uncomfortable. And so, I've coached now hundreds of people who've said to me, when I know exactly what the next thing is, then I'll make the move. When I've got the whole plan laid out, then I'll start to execute on it.
Yeah.
And that can work if you're going to go from one very rational setup to another. But if you say, I want to find something that feeds me more, that's more attuned to who I am, that's more of an expression of who I am, almost always you're going to have to step into the unknown. That's a big part of it.
I'd love to cut in just with a quote that I love from your book, which is, I'm not going to get it exact, which is, I don't know where we're going, but I know exactly how to get there, which is a phrase from one of your mentors as he's reading the tracks, meaning I don't know where we're going to wind up. I don't know how we're going to find this lion, but at any given moment, I know the next step. And I love that phrase.
First, the great trackers dial down the infinite possibilities. Firstly, they set off without knowing, right? They don't know where that lion is. They don't know where the animal is. They don't know where it's moving. They don't know what its move is. They set off without knowing, and then they dial down the infinite possibilities of where it could have gone to a single moment of presence. This first track, then this next first track, then this next first track. So what I say to people is, okay, you're going to have to get comfortable with not knowing for a while. Then you will start to, and it sounds like you're on the brink of a version of this. Then you are going to have to start to tune back in. We look, but we don't see. We listen, but we don't hear. A lot of us are sleepwalking. So one of the great things about a big career transformation or any kind of big life transformation is it forces you to tune back in. And that state of not knowing can be quite alive making. So I say you got to switch your attention back on. Like a good tracker, tracking is attention. Now you have to start to notice. You have to start notice literally what grabs your attention. You have to notice what you notice. You have to notice like people, places, experiences, things that literally make you feel energized in your body. You have to pay attention to people who literally make you lean forward in your chair. And you have to start saying, what is it about these people, these places, these things that it literally makes me vibrate a little bit. So that attention starts to give you incredible amount of information about things that are for you. I'm a big fan of the entrepreneur Jesse Eisler. Jesse's this, he founded multiple companies, started as a rapper, has a super weird Venn diagram. Now he's like a ultra athlete. He's always starting businesses and he's just a vibe guy. Every time I see Jesse doing something, I find myself like riveted by what he's up to. Because there's something about the way he's approaching his life, the intentionality, the output, the positivity that like it touches something in my deepest wild nature. I'm like, something about that has something to do with me. So it's that type of thing that you're attuning to. Inside of all of us, like if you grew up in the wild like me, when you look at a lion or you look at a leopard or you look at all the animals, they are so themselves, They are lions. No, they're pride animals. They know they're social. They like to hunt together. When leopards are born, they know that they are solitary. It's in their nature. And I think that all of us, and I found this now so often when I coach people, in our nature, there is so much that we actually do know about what brings us to life, what calls us forth. And if you take the time to slow down enough and actually start to attune to that information starts to arise. In the most unusual ways. And then the next phase is starting to take that sort of the vague, outlines of that information that's coming through to you. And then there is a place to start practically taking small steps towards it. And what I notice is when people start to do this over time as a tracker, stepping into the unknown, developing their track awareness, teaching themselves to read how their body is talking, see their tracks, willing to work on the first track, which is the smallest step you can take today towards something that feels a little bit more essential to you. And usually, Joseph Campbell had this quote, if you can see your whole life laid out before you, it's not your life. Whenever, and I'm sure you found this founding things, when you set off to make something, you don't get the whole map. You just get the feeling of like, well, this feels a little bit more like it. And so the willingness to take small iterative steps, I call that working on the first track. Being comfortable when you lose the track. All of tracking, at some point, if you are out there tracking an animal and at some point you set out to change your life, there is a point where you will lose the track. And it can be incredibly daunting because you let go of the known, you let go of the identity, the business, the job, the relationship in which you knew how to be. You started sitting in the unknown, you attuned to the tracks, you started moving on first tracks, and then suddenly the track is gone. And you're in that liminal space. You're not what you were, you're not what you will be. And in that place, a lot of people bail out on themselves. And they're just like, let's just go back. I knew how to do insurance. I knew how to scale companies. So you have to be willing to sit in that transformational tension, somewhere between what I was and what I will be. When the trackers lose the track, they'll do a few interesting things. One is they'll go back to the last clear track they had. And they'll say like, okay, well, what was it when I last knew I was really on track? Sometimes when I've coached people and I've said to them, when was the last time in your life you knew you were really on track? they'll go back 15, 20 years. I was just in college. It's unbelievable how clear it is to people.
Wow.
The other thing that they'll do is they'll move forward and just try things. And you don't see this in our culture that tells us you got to know and you got to get it right. When you're with an amazing tracker, they're dynamic. They're willing to try things. And anywhere where they don't get a clear track, they don't consider it wasted space. They call that the path of not here. It's helping them refine where they do want to go. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this, the willingness to be in transformation and live as a tracker is giving yourself the space to be in discovery rather than rigid knowns, and to let your identity be in liminal spaces as you start to find and add. I'll tell you one other thing just as we go about this. And so all of this falls into the practice of being in the practice, but example. Yeah.
Can you give an example for someone who is not necessarily in the bush? So just to some of these are, you're in a corporate job. It's not fulfilling you. You start to look for things that you love, which might be very different. It might be jazz music. It might be a particular genre of fiction. It might be, I don't know. And so you start looking for that. And you then, what would like a small step be for someone like that?
Well, I would say, you can there's two ways to go. Either when you really know that you're stuck and you're at the end of it, sometimes it's a trapeze. You have to let go of one trapeze and fly through the air and trust that the other trapeze is coming. That's how it is for some people. Unless they commit, they stay in a midway zone. Other people can bridge. And so in your example, what I would start saying is you're stuck in something that doesn't feel good. Switch your attention back on. Start to say, I don't know how to come into this next iteration of myself, and that's okay, but I'm paying attention now. Start to notice what lights you up, what energizes you. If it's jazz music, how do you get yourself into that space more often? Like literally, do you start going to jazz clubs 2 nights a week? Do you start taking jazz classes? Do you buy a trumpet? What do you do to start moving towards that with no sense of how that could fund your life, how that could take care of your family, just moving the energy towards it, getting into that space and starting to notice what happens when you do that without a full sense of like, okay, I could quit my career and start a jazz factory, whatever it is, like just getting into it. When people start to do that, interesting things start to open up. And that's why we call it a transformational process. And when you've done it enough, there is something mystical to it. When someone starts to say, I am willing to open my awareness to make this change, I'm willing to start taking steps towards it without knowing where it's going. I'm willing to face the uncertainty of financial, instability. I'm willing to start just trying things. Almost always, more information starts to unfold.
Go ahead.
So just one thing on that, to where we started, which is, people are so afraid of this. We live in a culture of scarcity. That is almost built into the structure of the psyche that we live in a consumerist culture. When the individual self is constantly cut off from the greater whole, the search for meaning is reduced to a state of comparison all the time, right? So that comparison is scarcity built into the egoic structure of a consumerist society. So when you feel scarcity, it's not just you. Everything in the way a consumerist society structures your own psyche will do that to you. Your own ego will commoditize you. And so you'll feel things inside yourself like a dynamic, something like this, comparative, but also how am I doing in comparison to everyone else?
That is so fascinating because I grew my business in Latin America. I left and I went to I studied in a relatively poor area of Costa Rica, and I felt so free. And I've come back and I live now in a very expensive neighborhood in Malibu. And I don't think I really fully acknowledged the intense, subtle pressure that the society puts on it. It really makes me wonder where I'm going to live next because it's worse this way. Exactly.
And in Costa Rica, more collective, more community, more of a we society, a flatter, more connected community structure. So I'm just, by way of like, this is how some of what you have to wade through. The part piece on it is, for example, I was coaching a guy the other day and he said to me, very successful, I want to leave. I reached a pinnacle, wants to go do something else, wants to leave his job, wants to do something different. But in the coaching, this fear keeps coming up. And then he reveals to me that when he was about 10 years old, his father left a job in the hope of doing something different and never got hired again. And so now he is in totally different circumstances, but that trauma, which I would say is the past, introjecting into the current moment, is starting to arise and take him out of presence. And so there will be some things of like the scarcity of the culture, but there can also be fears and traumas from the past. Maybe you grew up in a tight financial situation where there wasn't financial stability. Maybe you grew up with a parent who you saw struggle all the time. And now it's time for you to make that jump. And, now those old traumas that you lived with start to surface themselves.
Fast. Yes. Yeah. Those past influences and collective influences. And I think that's part of, as I'm just reflecting on my own life experience, what was so liberating about Costa Rica was no one knew me. So my past was never, ever reflected back to me. I used to be very shy. Day one, I showed up in Costa Rica and I was outgoing and nobody could gainsay that. Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating to see how intensely, and I think I underestimated it, my choice of environment helped shape and mold me. And I think I would like to be much more intentional about that going forward.
It was also, that old, when you're in a transformation, one of the big challenges is like going back to your family, going back to the town you grew up in, because like they have you pegged in an identity. And now if you're trying to change, you might, they're like, well, that's not who you are. This is where we've got you over here. And the other thing is if you actually are changing, sometimes you can threaten their sense of identity. If you are doing this, well, that means that I could be doing it, but I can't be doing it. So you must be out of your mind. There's a way that like people will enslave you to their sense of what's possible in old identity structures. So the place is important. Giving yourself the freedom. I'm not saying you should run away because that's never the answer, but realizing that changes in identity do require different environments internally and externally.
I've come to realize it's a very tender stage. And one of the ways that I dealt with it was I was on the flip side of that, which I had all of these pressures that you're describing. And then to deal with it, I tried to universalize my particular experience was, no, you're all wrong. You're all supposed to be entrepreneurs. You all have to read the 4-hour work week. and I became extremely evangelical and probably not to destroy their life, but drug some people along with me that who it wasn't authentically for. And they found their way back to wherever was right for them in that moment. But I realized that you have to find a way, and I think just bringing awareness to the tenderness of the transformational stage, you've got to find some way to acknowledge and support that. And I did it by getting I got the heck out of there, and then I formed my own little commune of this is how the world is. But there's probably a more aware way to do that for any future transformation.
Exactly the same thing. I mean, no one was safe at a party with me. They were going to get coached whether they liked it or not.
Exactly.
But what I've come to find, and you're right, like what I've come to find is that people who learn to follow this, what I would call the track, and be in this transformation, they usually pop out in pretty original and unique places. And then when you've really been around someone who is deeply, authentically in their expression, what's amazing is I've come to find you don't have to bang people over the head, because when I've been around someone like that, and hopefully when people have felt that off of me, you can just feel it in someone. It's an authenticity, it's a realness. And then it becomes an almost kind of modern day activism, because people who really touch that place, almost always they're more creative. They almost always simplify their life. There's a natural leaning towards being of service, trying to uplift others. there's usually like a quietness into nature that comes with it. They want to make things and be creative and share that. And when you get around them, you just sense that in them, and you start asking yourself, like, what's going on over there? And people naturally feel drawn to it. And that to me is more the embodied present state that teaches, like when St. Francis says, wherever you go, preach the gospel, only when absolutely necessary, use words.
Yeah.
It's just like, that's a dude who knows what it's like to have a vibe and again, away from trying to be anything, and just authentically yourself as the most powerful thing you can offer.
I know that what I did at one point was I took all of those things that you describe, which are characteristic of the present person, and tried to adopt them to become that. So yeah, I'm going to try going into nature. I'm going to try liking sorts of esoteric things. I'm going to try all of this sorts of stuff. And I think as I was listening, the difference is that those are emergent properties when you are, when you feel great and you don't need all of the success and you don't need all that. And it might come to you, which was actually what happened in my case. I think that there was a point in my life where I was deeply just on my own weird track, and I was planning to live in Latin America on $1,500 or $2,000 a month forever. And then things exploded in the business. And there's then a difficulty. I don't know if you've experienced this, of I'd grown so accustomed to not needing, and then I attached to some of the toys that came along with it. And I'm having to untangle myself these days and get back to that like authentic, oh no, I just feel good.
Oh my goodness. It's so fast, right? And then also like the challenges of getting known for something, and then feeling like, okay, well, I'm successful doing that, but it's not really where the track leads me anymore. But it works. That's what people want from me. All of that type of artistic challenge.
And there's a whole sector of business advice, which is find the thing that people like and just do it repeatedly for a long period of time, and you can make millions, and it's true, millions and millions and even billions of dollars with that playbook. But I think there are perhaps a lot of people, if not everybody, certainly myself and you, that even if it worked to make the money and get the fame, it wouldn't work for.
Well, exactly. And that's why, you got to go where the track leads you. But having said that, I also want to say that you sound like you're a dyed-in-the-wool entrepreneur. Like, the vibe I get is, to start things. Like, so it doesn't have to be like going into nature or being silent, or it can be like entrepreneurship is my thing. And that is where I'm fully embodied. That's where I'm in my state. So I don't want people to think that there's like rules about where it leads. Like wherever it leads you, it could lead you into, hardcore day trading, and that is what lights you up. Or it could lead you into founding, the future insurance companies of the world. I don't know, but like it's got like, you'll know it because it's your thing, and it actually is coming out of a place that feels incredibly energizing and generative.
I think that's the key point. It's the aliveness, the energy, the love.
Exactly. And that's a great catch. It's the aliveness, the energy, and the love. That word and that experience, that state is, I think it's the X factor piece in this, allowing your expression to be emergent in you. When where it's like, it's not just that I'm good at this and I love doing this, I'm energized doing this, but there's like a deeper, I feel like myself, and I feel like I offer something truly when I'm here when I'm doing this thing.
Yeah. Yes. I know we've only got a little bit. I really wanted to touch on your shamanistic experiences. So for me, a shift in this, the first phase or the second phase, whatever phase I'm in now, got kicked off with an ayahuasca ceremony, I would say, which was just, I had never done anything like it. And since then I've had a connection to that space. And I'm very curious what your experience has been. Are you simply participating? Are you now guiding and leading? And I'm not really familiar with the traditions in Africa at all, or even what substances are used.
So yeah, I was introduced to that space maybe 12 years ago or so. So before, John Hopkins started doing studies again and that sort of thing. a little bit before the psychedelic sort of revolution that we've seen maybe over the last 5 or 6 years. And I found it to be incredibly transformative. And actually, funnily, what was most profound about it is when I was first in that space, and I saw the way that I was introduced to it is it was informal in a way. And so people would gather, and there were no rules for the space. It was not a lie on your mat, be isolated, because who introduced it to me, the man who introduced it to me, he believed that Western culture was isolated already. Whereas if you had taken medicine in the jungle, you're already connected to everything.
You need to go private.
In yourself. But when you're taking medicine in a patriarchal society, you're isolated. And so connection is actually helpful. And so when the medicine first came on, and there was different experiences there, but for me, I could read so much of what was going on in people by the way they moved their bodies, because to me, I saw the primal movements that I had grown up reading in animals, and the subtle language of energetics inside of that. And so I had a real understanding of where people were at based on just like subtle shifts and movements in the body. And so I was very quickly, even in that first session, into a form of facilitation, sitting for people and like creating different energetic containers for people to work inside of.
Did you have any of that language at the time? Was that how you understood it, or was it almost...
I sort of grew into understanding it, but I just knew what was happening in that room.
Fascinating.
And he saw that I knew, but I was too uncooked in my own process. So it was like, it was a bit raw. Yeah. And so then for the next like 5 or so, or 3 years, I was then more in the apprentice state. And then I spent about 5 years sitting for people, 5 or 6 years sitting for people. And now I am sort of, I will use the plants as a tool at a very specific point in someone's process. But it will be very specific, and I'm not sitting as much as I was, because it's very it's really deep when you're in there a lot with people and you're holding a lot of energy for people. So I still am fascinated. I'm still a student, and I still think ceremonial spaces are like culturally critical. We need places to remember, to have an encounter with something mysterious, to have an encounter with ourselves. I think our society is in desperate need of that. And what naturally emerges out of that is community and connection. And so I think that it is such an important tool for our time. And I use it very intentionally at a specific point now.
What amendments, if any, because you mentioned that one that was really interesting, which is this needs to be more communal because you people are already so fragmented from one another.
Yeah.
I'm curious, there's a lot of people that I totally get. They're trying to preserve the historical tradition of how these were and are used in the jungles or out in the bush. I'm curious what amendments you think need to be made for the modern person, if there's additional ones other than that, because you mentioned community, and I've done it a couple of times, and these communities can form, but they actually, in my experience, haven't formed easily or quickly or in any sort of long-lasting way that has sustained outside of the space.
Yeah, I can tell you that for my teacher, who was Peruvian, he was not. There is a place for rigid cultural protecting the way that certain cultures have done it, but he was for evolving it. And so slightly more organically structured spaces, connection at the center, and using empathogens that allowed for deeper connection, and safety and connection at the center, teaching people how to be with the medicine. And so that's sometimes a bit different to just arriving and having your first ever psychedelic experience be 3 cups of ayahuasca, and like it'll take you where you need to go. Like, I think that this culture, with what they're already carrying, sometimes needs to learn how to be with those spaces a little bit more. So
Yeah.
teaching people how to be with it, understanding that experiential, the plants and the medicines are tools, and they're here to help you experience ways of being in different states, and that they should teach you how to be sensitive to that in your everyday life. So they're learning tools.
Yeah.
Um,
I love a lot of that. 3 cups of ayahuasca, good luck, was sort of my first experience.
yeah.
And I was asking, what should I, I'll just breathe. And I realize, yeah, there was probably a different consciousness that was coming up around, and you were sitting with people that you knew for your entire life versus probably you don't know anyone who does this. You're stepping into a totally different circle. And so I do think that there need to be adaptations. And I like the ones that you've suggested around. My own experience has been, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a Westerner like me jump right into ayahuasca. I think there's a shallow end that one can get into to learn to come into deeper contact with yourself in a way that we have, I think, almost purposely blocked in our culture, right? There's never a chance to sit quietly with yourself. So maybe not ayahuasca first.
No, I think that's right. And I think that, I think that people also, there can be a glorifying from Westerners of the traditional culture, saying they know, we don't know. And now that's true in some senses, but there's also like deeply, there's also people who are not doing good work in the native cultures. There's, wherever you go, you find people being people. And so like, I've been in ceremonies where like, there's rigid rules. I've been in ceremonies where people are breaking rules. I've been in ceremonies where, people have allowed different things to happen. But the first time I started going into Navajo ceremonies, for example, I was like so afraid I'm going to get something wrong. But, white people get things wrong. Native people get things wrong. People get things right. It's just, it's more like allowing the space to be what the space is. And, allowing for all the complexity to be there, and allowing for yourself to find your own authority within it.
That's beautiful.
And coming with respect and coming with openness, but ultimately learning respect. And I guess the other thing that I would say is, like, funnily enough, everywhere we go in our society, we like to parentify things. Like someone else is the grown-ups and they know how this whole thing works. And in my experience, part of work with the plants is to come into your own authority and to come into at least integrity with your own knowing. And I don't mean authority like grandiosity or narcissism. I just mean over time, self-trust, that you could go anywhere and at the end, trust your own heart.
Yeah.
Trust your own integrity.
Which is deeply connected to self-responsibility, which is what comes of this, I am responsible for.
Yes.
I'm charting my own path in my career in this medicine space, and the results of it I am deeply responsible for, and will not point the finger. Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. We've gotten to the end of our hour. What do you have? You said you're working on some story stuff. Where are you? Where can people find you? What do you have coming out next?
Charlie, so I'm working on this piece of work at the moment, which is sort of the evolution of the tracker. It's called Story Hunter. And if tracking is attuning to purpose, story hunting is developing a relationship with narratives, and how, as people, we live inside of stories. We live inside of the stories we tell about ourselves. We live inside the stories we tell of the world. And I've found that in some ways, I think that part of the way the culture is structured is we're losing meaning. We're losing ways to make meaning when we don't gather and tell stories together, or at least approach life like it is a field full of stories in which we can choose which ones we chase, and we can choose which ones we put ourselves in line with. And so story hunting is a practice that is a practice centered in how do I find and make more meaning. And I found that in order to do that, you have to become tuned in to the way you tell your story and the way that stories come to you and the characters you're willing to go out and find and the adventures you're willing to go on. All of those things are the fabric that when you weave it together, start making meaning. And so right now, Story Hunter is out on all platforms, and people can find more from me on boydvarty.com. And there's the Track Your Life podcast is on Spotify, and there's a whole lot of different adventures on there.
Beautiful. And you said Story Hunter's out on all platforms. Is it a book? Is it what is the format?
A podcast series. So I like to do podcast series where I go on an adventure. So I lived alone in a tree for 40 days. And I did a body of work around that. And then the new piece is Story Hunter, which is literally going out into the desert with the Bushman people, finding stories. The first part of it is the technical principles of story hunting, and the second part is living with the Bushmen and hunting stories in the desert in the Kalahari Desert.
Cool. I'm excited to check that out. That's going to be very interesting. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Man, great to be with you, Chip.
Thank you.